Hello, and welcome back to another fun-filled episode of the Hammercast. I'm your host, Alex, the Hebrew Hammer Salkin, and joining me once again on the Hammercast, almost a year to the day or somewhere thereabouts, since his previous a triumphant debut on the podcast, is none other than retired master kettlebell instructor, Geoff Neupert, very smart, very strong guy. We're going to be talking about minimalism and the pros and cons, his take on it, my take on it, and a lot of other people's takes on it. So I think you'll find this to be a raucous, rockin' good time. Before we begin, I always want to remind my listeners that if you have not already, I highly recommend that you get my 9-minute kettlebell and bodyweight challenge. It is ironically enough, kind of a minimalist collection of gait pattern oriented movements that can be done with just a kettlebell and bodyweight. And as the name implies, it is done in just 9 minutes. So it can fit into any current workout that you're doing without overloading you. And in many cases, it might even enhance what you're doing. I've had a lot of very nice compliments on it. Geoff, I think even you said that you thought it was quite nice.
Yes, I decided I'm going to one-up you and come up with 8 minutes. The 8-minute. Yeah.
I don't know how I can top
it. Mary, right? Yeah.
Correct. This is going to be very, very difficult. If somebody comes up with a 7-minute kettlebell and bodyweight challenge, we're going to be in real trouble. We meaning me. So at any rate, go to 9minutechallenge.com and you can get your own free copy of that. I think you will enjoy it quite a bit. And now, without further ado, Geoff, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Alex. Good to be here.
My pleasure. You know, we were just talking a little bit before about the impetus behind doing this podcast. You know, if it were up to me, I would have you on all the time. But, you know, I think you need an excuse to bring people on because otherwise it just feels like filler. And it was sometime in January, I posted a meme that I thought was very funny. I rarely ever make my own memes, even though I enjoy them. And for those of you who are familiar, it was like the really big muscular dog and then the little small, tiny, runty dog. And the concept behind the meme is you're comparing or contrasting oftentimes two similar situations at different points in history. And so I was pointing out that in the early 2000s, there was a lot more variety in kettlebell training. People really seemed to be tougher with their training versus now, people seem in general to be very focused on quote unquote minimalism. And I'll explain why I say quote unquote in just a second here. Geoff took umbrage with it and he wrote a great email about it. So I responded to his email. I think we should do a podcast on it. So here we are. So we'll talk a little bit more about why I said quote unquote minimalism in a minute. But I think to start off with, it only makes sense to get a definition of minimalism. And it seems that a lot of people have a lot of definitions. So I'm interested in hearing yours, and in particular, how you view it and then how you apply it to your programs.
Well, it's going to be a minimalist definition. It's one sentence long. It's what's the least amount of work that I can do or you can do and still make measurable, visible progress.
Mm-hmm. So. Now, I like that. And I also like that you've kept in with the philosophy of minimalism and keeping it down to one sentence. I think would have been ironic if it had been anything longer than that. Even 2 clauses would have been too much. But the reason I say this is because actually I like that definition. And I think that with it, the good thing about it is that it's very principle oriented. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree.
Yeah. Now, if for people who want to know the difference between, let's say, principle and a tactic, the principle is kind of like a guiding philosophy or a series of rules that are going to apply to something no matter what. The tactic would be, you know, something you might use to apply that rule. Does that sound fair?
That sounds fair. Yeah.
All right.
Found within the principles. Yeah.
Exactly. So the reason I say this is because Geoff and I were talking beforehand. And by the way, Geoff is also doing a very good job of doing minimal talking during this podcast, but that's actually my fault because I just keep going on and on. But we were talking a little bit before about how there doesn't seem to be a very good definition of minimalism. And momentarily, I can read off some of the other definitions that people provided. But I'm curious, how do you apply the concept of minimalism in your programs, not only for yourself, that you yourself do, but also the ones that people buy, in such a way that gets them the measurable progress that they're after?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. I think it boils down to 4 key ideas. So here we were breaking out the minimalism, not
Mhm.
as minimal as you would expect, but really it comes down to this: what's the person's needs, wants, and desires,
Mhm.
right? We can go into that a little bit here shortly. What are their available resources? Okay, we'll dig deeper into that if you want. What's their injury history? Okay, and then what are their exercise preferences? Right. I mean, we come from a kettlebell and bodyweight type background, or at least that's the community in which this podcast is going to be aired. But what if you don't like kettlebells? What if you hate doing body weight? Right? Your idea of minimalism is going to be much different from ours.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it's a very good point. I was just reviewing Marty Gallagher's book, The Purposeful Primitive, which I have
Mhm.
right here next to me, just prior to the podcast. And there's a good amalgamate of people who did very minimalistic type of training in his book and succeeded very, very
Mhm.
well, and other
Yep.
people who did very non-minimalistic type of training and succeeded very well. So I think this goes back to what you were talking about of people's training preferences. So
Mhm.
I would definitely be interested in digging deeper into all those different elements that you talked about. So why don't we start from the beginning, and maybe we'll get some stories uh, that exemplify the ideas that you've talked about, people that you've worked with, you yourself, things of that nature. So let's start right from the beginning. We'll work through all four.
Sure. Well, so the first thing is needs, wants, and desires, right?
Mhm.
So I think the interesting thing that kicked off this podcast was that in my email response to said fitness professional, which was you, which was hilarious because a lot of people emailed me back and they said, oh, I saw that post by Alex and I just chuckled, right? I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm 49 and you're what, 31, 32?
You're very kind. I'm 35.
35. Oh my goodness, man, you're getting old.
I know. I don't feel it, but
Yeah, no, you're not getting old. And neither am I. But there's a big difference between somebody who's training at 49,
Mhm.
right? Somebody who's training at 19.
Mhm.
All right. When I was 19, I lived in the gym. I was in college. Um, I made sure that all my classes ended around 4:10, I think was when classes ended. And then I was in the gym between 4:30 and 5, and I stayed there until 7 or 7:30 at night. At which point I went to the dining hall and ate anything that wasn't nailed down. My goal was to be a 275-pound powerlifter. I started at 165 pounds. I made it to 252 pounds before my knees were screaming and I was sweating and huffing and puffing just walking up the stairs. Right. So that's a much different world. Oh, and I could sleep 8-9 hours, right? On the weekends, I'd sleep 12 hours and, my rent was paid for, my board, right? Food, everything was taken care of. So my responsibility was to go to school and lift. And really, I just viewed it as my responsibility was to lift and make sure I got enough good grades that kept my dad pleased so that I could, he'd keep paying for my college.
Mhm.
So that's a much different place to live than, hey, you know what, you've got multiple businesses or you've got a job and you've got kids and a mortgage and whatever, payments and, all kinds of, you're living the modern life. So my needs as a 19-year-old are much different than my needs as a 49-year-old, right? My wants and my desires are much different now than they were back then. Back then, I just wanted to be huge, right? And now, that's not really a priority.
Mhm.
Right now, I need to make sure that I maintain a roof over my head and there's food in my multiple freezers, right? And I can survive the zombie apocalypse. Much different mindset. I'm just kidding about the zombie apocalypse.
No, he's
But
not,
much
folks.
different mindset, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Absolutely.
back then I trained, 2.5 hours a day, 4 to 5 days a week. I would love to be able to train like that. That's called a vacation for me,
Mhm.
right? But an hour max is what I get 3 to 5 days a week. And usually it's not even that much,
Mhm.
right? So,
Yeah, I think with all that in mind, that plus the definition that you gave earlier of minimalism, like I mentioned before we even started recording, I think we're probably more on the same page than we're not. Uh,
absolutely.
the issue is because obviously, I'll tell you what, periodically, sometimes I've written programs for myself that get me to training for like an hour, and I'm like, I hate this. Like, I got to cut this down to 45 minutes. And it's not out of like a sense of a need for minimalism, but it's like I have other things I have to do.
Right.
But the real I think the big issue behind all of it is something that you and I will also both probably agree with is not optimal. And it's that, again, because there's not really a set definition for what minimalism is in training, people just kind of manifest it however they want. And I think what we often see is that people are, their idea of minimalism is as follows. It's basically limiting themselves to the same exercises ad infinitum, limiting themselves to only certain variations of those exercises, limiting themselves to just the same set and rep schemes over and over again, and limiting themselves to just the same tools. Now, there's one thing to be said about, if you only have certain tools at your disposal, then obviously you have to make do with that. There's certainly nothing wrong with it. But I'll take like an example would be, and I'm not giving this as an example to call anybody out or try to be controversial or anything, but like Simple and Sinister, which I have done, I like quite a bit. I mean, I did it. I haven't done it in a very long time, but I did like the original iteration of it in like 2014. And I think, a lot of people who do it haven't read enough of Pavel's other work to realize that he likes and recommends doing more exercises. Like his book Beyond Bodybuilding is just like a masterpiece of talking about how to really dominate at a wide array of different exercises using what we talked about earlier, same principles. So I think what happens a lot of times, and it's understandable because I've been there, is that new jacks will see that and they'll be like, they won't be able to see the forest for the trees. So they start to see Simple and Sinister as like, the alpha and the omega, to use a quote that we're all familiar with. And then they stick with it ad infinitum until something happens. Like best case scenario, they don't get very good results anymore. And it's not because there's a problem with swings and get-ups, but they haven't done enough other things that are going to properly prepare them for doing heavy swings and heavy get-ups. Again, I'm sure you've seen plenty of this. How do you recommend that somebody who has a mind for minimalism take on something like that in such a way that they're actually going to continue to make measurable progress over the long term?
That's a tough question. If you want to talk about specifically Simple and Sinister, I would just follow the plan.
Sure.
Pavel's brilliant at program design. I personally have never done Simple and Sinister. I hate doing swings and get-ups. I have done more than my fair share of them, but they just bore me. For the record, that's not what you asked. So no. I don't. I would just say, here's the problem. Here's why minimalism fails so many people, is because people aren't clear on what they want, right? So if we take that first needs, wants, desires, right? People have this. They have this. What do they want to do? What, right? And then we have to balance that against what can they do, and then what they're willing to do.
Yeah.
Right. And so somebody will tackle Simple and Sinister and say they want to do it, but they're not willing to do it. So they make changes in the program. Right. Yeah. And then they say, well, I tried that. I hate that word. Okay. But that's exactly what they did. They dabbled with it and it didn't work for me. And then they post it on the internets and then it gets a bad rap. But what about all the people it did work for? Right. Like, are you such a special snowflake to use? What was it? Is that Mark Ribto, who always calls people, you're not a special snowflake, right?
Probably, yeah.
Right. Like, are you just that special that broad-based, principles don't apply to you? And so my very first point is just don't overthink the program. Do it exactly as it's outlined. Do the halos, do the goblet squats, do the prying hip flexor stretch, do the breathing between sets, do everything that Pavel has outlined. Don't change anything, and then see where you get to, right? Sure. Like if it says 3 days a week, do it 3 days a week. If it says 5 days a week, do it 5 days a week. If the program says you should be able to talk or sing the national anthem between sets before you start the next set, then do that. But so many people think that they know better. Right. Oh, no, that, I've got my way. That's your way, but I've got my way. So I'm going to do it my way. Right. And their way has never worked and it never works. And then they hop from program to program saying these things don't work. That would be my take on that.
And it's interesting you should say this too, because I have two things that really pop out to me. So number one, they're following a set of principles, whether they know it or not. And their principle is, I have to make changes to this rather than trusting the plan.
Right.
Which, and I'm not saying that there is no place for that, but I think you have to be pretty good to know what changes you would need to make. And then number two is that, again, their idea of quote unquote doing it, whatever the program is not really very well defined. So they might say, I'm doing simple and sinister, but then they're doing a lot of other things too. Now, I'm not against adding things into program if it's complementary, but a lot of times people are just adding things that don't really need to be there.
Well, I think, Mike Mahler, I don't know if you've ever read any of his stuff.
Oh, yeah.
He's one of the early kettlebell guys.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
kind of came up together. He made a really interesting observation about 15 years ago. He said that a lot of kettlebell people are stimulus junkies. And a lot of people feel like they need to add something to any given program. Or, if a program's 3 days a week and that type of loading parameters produce some of the strongest men in pre-steroid history. I mean, a 3-day week program is what the York/US Olympic weightlifting team used, right? But somehow it's not good enough for them, right? And so they're addicted to the stimulus of working out. It's the feeling or sensation they get while working out, not necessarily training, not the results, right? So I think people fall into that trap.
Yeah. That's a very good point, because I think, if you're looking at goal setting, because you talked about what are people's needs, wants, and desires, I think is how you phrased it. I think a lot of people most people look at goals as like, okay, I'm at point A, I need to get to point B. And so that's maybe like a destination goal, we might call it. But a lot of people are better off doing stuff that's more like progress goals. So it's like, what are you doing every day that is going to move you measurably forward? And if that's the case, you simply have to find a means of training that is going to produce the results that you're after, that is going to be appropriate for that type of approach. Because some people can't handle resting 4 days a week. Not that they don't have the capacity for it, but they just don't want to do that. And so I feel like the people who are in who have that kind of a mindset, if you give them something to do, and this is not meant to sound like belittling or anything like that, but it reminds me of an episode of The Simpsons where Homer is trying to help Marge make a cake for Maggie. And so Marge has already baked the cake, and Homer's job is to decorate it with like Maggie's first birthday. And so Marge is like, Homer, you spelled her name wrong. He's like, what do you mean? It isn't McGaggy's first birthday. So he reads it back and he sees he put like an extra letter in there. And so he's like, oh, better fix that. And then, so he eats like the extra G, and then he starts eating all the other ones. And Marge is like, Homer, stop. I made a cake for you to ruin over there. And so there's a cake that's just a mishmash of all these like candied letters and, stuff like that. And so he goes over there and starts to ruin that. So in a way, I think you have to kind of apply, I think it can be helpful for some people to apply a similar mindset where the stuff that they're doing on let's say it's a 3-day a week focus, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but on Tuesday and Thursday, you give them something that they can do that will not only not interfere with Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but might actually make it a little bit better. Meaning you're filling in a couple of gaps. Maybe you have them doing stuff that's not going to be, I see you got the Rock,
You mean
eyebrow.
like no, that's the Spock eyebrow, man. That was Spock before the Rock, that was
the Rock, Doc Ock.
You mean like the 9-minute bodyweight kettlebell crawling for something like that?
As one very excellent example.
Yes, as an example, right? Yeah.
Exactly. But something like that, actually, it is a decent example, even though I wasn't consciously hinting at it. You picked up the subconscious.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Something like that would allow you to keep training every day so that you can keep it into your regular rotation, but it's not going to get in the way. But you're right. A lot of people have a very hard time following programs if they're addicted to the stimulus. And so for people like that, I mean, apart from my suggestion of giving them something to do on the in-between days so that they're occupied, as it were, but they're actually, doing something that's still moving them noticeably forward. I know that you've got a couple of programs, like the Giant, very famously, is just a 3-day-a-week program, and it produces excellent results. So what do you tell people when they're like, yeah, but what do I do on those days when I'm not doing presses?
Yeah, I tell them to go live their life, right? So go participate in their life, or work harder. So my typical responses are go live your life, like go spend time with your kids or your wife or your husband or your significant other, your family. Go engage in social activities that you say you want to do, right? That's the first thing. Go live your life. The second thing is work harder. If you have that much energy on your off days, you didn't work hard enough on your on days, right? So work harder. Use tension techniques. Don't just let the kettlebells drop in the rack from the press. Pull them down. Active negatives, right? Compress your rest periods. Right? Just work harder. Be more focused. That's the second thing. And then trying to remember what the third thing is. I had a third thing, but it's usually one of the three things. The third thing I didn't mention. So it's live your life, work harder. And then I'll give them something complimentary to do, like we talked about. I guess that would be the third thing. Go out and take a walk, right? I mean, we're in some parts of the world, we're on the other side of a pandemic, right? One of the biggest things, this is probably going to get shut off your podcast. Sorry, man. They're just going to take it down as we mentioned.
No, not by me. I'll tell you that.
Not by you.
You want.
But look, I mean, one of the biggest issues is people are sedentary, right? Who got hammered with COVID. Sedentary, overweight, okay, and they don't get outside enough. So just go outside and walk, get your vitamin D, which has been, it's free, right? It's been shown to, if not prevent, at least ameliorate, big word, the symptoms of COVID, right?
Certainly.
So go outside and get some vitamin D, get a walk, de-stress. Go do that 3 days a week or 4 days a week. So that would be complimentary. That's more of a health goal, I think. I think everybody should walk near daily for health because, as they say inside OS, walking is the automatic reset, right? So
couldn't agree more. And I think I've thought about this because people periodically like to ask these things like, oh, well, what is like if you could only do one thing, like one movement, what would it be? And for me, the answer is walking for sure. It's like, I know Mark Rifkin talks about how you don't realize how important walking is until you can't, because for so many years he had just such a bad knee that like he had to plan his life around, how far he could hobble because of how bad it was. And, I've seen the same thing happen with others. I mean, my mom had issues with walking as a result of a variety of orthopedic issues and postural problems and things like that. So people don't really understand like the value of taking it easy when you're supposed to take it easy, and then training really hard when you're supposed to train hard.
Yeah, listen, I mean, I've written years about this concept of contrast within training, right?
Yeah.
Black and white. Everybody wants to turn training into like this gray area, right? So nobody likes gray, right? Nobody likes a gray overcast
unless
sky.
There are 50 shades of it. Sometimes people like that.
Yeah. All right.
You're like, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, I definitely threw a curveball there. In fact, it hit me in the head.
Yeah.
So seriously, just work harder, work as hard as you possibly can, right? On your training days, and then rest as hard as you possibly can on your non-training days and see what kind of results you get. I guarantee if you do everything that you know how to do, but aren't doing in your training days, like if you turn Facebook off and turn the gram off and stop checking your email between sets and actually put some motivational music on, whatever that is for you, right? And just blocked everything out. I guarantee that if you increase your focus, you're going to increase your output, and therefore you're going to increase your results. You'll also increase your fatigue, which means you'll need to rest more. So you won't need to ask, what should I do on my off days? Because you'll be doing it.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point that you make, because I think a lot of times when people train, they're really not, I've tried.
Hold on, I need to check Facebook. And
please do. Yes. Yeah. Your favorite book, as I understand.
That's right. Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of people don't read many more books than just Facebook. I think we need to change that. But yeah, one of the things that I've noticed, and I've tried in my programs and courses and things like that to really hammer home is multiple things that you can do to make your sets and reps more productive. Because now challenging, for instance, doesn't necessarily mean productive. Like it would be challenging to front squat a pair of kettlebells on like a Swiss ball. And even if you could successfully do it, it would probably not be very productive, right?
Right. Yeah.
Whereas if you're doing a slow negative, a pause at the bottom of that squat, grunting and standing up very strongly, making sure that everything is staying tight as you do it. Just a couple of sets like that, you're going to feel a lot more out of than if you're just kind of lackadaisically kind of dropping into the bottom position like we talked about earlier,
Right.
not really taking advantage of every phase of a given rep. And that ability to sharpen the gray area into a focus of black or white certainly does help quite a bit. But I'm curious about something that I've noticed a lot of, and I would like to hear your take on it. And it's that I noticed that a lot of people who come to me and really excel in the stuff that I offer in terms of programs and challenges, it's because I aim to try to focus on the things that they've not done enough of. And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier with how a lot of people will try to focus, or will try to define minimalism, which is kind of like a reduction of their choices in exercises, thinking that there's certain exercises that are just sacrosanct and can be done to the exclusion of all others. So let's say somebody has finished the Giant, which is kind of your flagship program, certainly the one that at the moment is like what you're most popular for right now. Let's say somebody's done that. They've worn out a given pair of kettlebells, and they want to start working on something else, but they just don't know what exactly it is they should do. What do you recommend using stuff that they're familiar with, like a minimalist approach? What do you recommend that they do in order to make sure that their musculature is staying balanced out? They're not moving themselves into what you've termed as pattern overload. I think quoting from Paul Chek, where you just do something to the point where it's like poisonous to the body. How do you get them to avoid stuff like that while still maintaining the similar philosophy of the training?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is, and this is going to sound horrible, but I don't.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I don't unless they ask. Right. So I often get emails, what should I do after the Giant? And my first response usually is, have you finished the Giant? No, I haven't. Well, finish the Giant. Let's get that checked off. And then, so many people are worried about what's coming that they fail to take advantage of what's now.
Yeah.
Right. So if you get through the Giant, you'll figure out where your weaknesses are by the end of it. Right. Typically, I don't want to be the guy unless people have given me permission. So if you're on my email list, you've given me permission, but I don't want to be the guy. I'm sure you've seen this or had this happen to you, or if you ever trained in a gym, you probably did this to somebody, where you just walk up to somebody and offer them your opinion without them asking. Right.
It's been a while, but yes, I have done that.
Right. I mean, that's how they taught us to, get clients back in the early days. You just walk up and smile and engage in conversation, then offer a free piece of advice or something like that. Usually people aren't interested, right? So typically people don't ask me, what should they do after the Giant? Mm-hmm. I think you can do whatever you want to do. I have two parallel thought processes when it comes to training. One is you should have some kind of restoration process intact, running in the background at all times. Mm-hmm. Most people do not want to hear that, so they won't do it. That's what you should do that's the answer to what should you do on the off days. That was my answer to question number 3, or point number 3, about 20 minutes ago. So what happens when you wake up at 12:30 in the middle of the night, which happened again last night, which is awesome. So I think you should have a parallel restoration program running in the background at all times. Okay. Because then you'll know what are my areas of deficits that I need to fix. And you'll be working on them in the process, whether you're running the Giant, whether you're running strong, whether you're doing your 9-minute program. These programs will be running in the background. So I run a restoration program concurrently with anything that I do. So what's that look like, Geoff? Well, on training days is part of the warm-up, and sometimes it's part of the cool down. My restoration program includes FABs, which we've talked about before, functional antagonistic balance exercises, which are exercises. And I know your listeners might be thinking, well, what does this have to do with minimalism? This falls into my definition of what's the least amount of work I can do and still make measurable, visible progress, right? Least amount of work doesn't mean no work. And least amount of work is different for every person, right? That's where what do you want to do? What can you do? What are you willing to do? Right. So you got the restoration work. So I got FABs on off days when I'm not training with the kettlebell, the barbell, or bodyweight exercises. I'll just do 20 minutes of restoration work. Okay. That's the first train of thought. The second train of thought is you should cycle. I have a 4-phase program where you cycle a block of focused restoration work into your training. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that cycle looks like this. It's restoration work. You find and fix your weak links. Okay. And then the second cycle is you build strength, you get stronger based on the corrections you just made to your frame. Mm-hmm. Okay. So if you've found your weak links, you've fortified them. Now your whole system can be stronger. So you can overload it in new and different ways. And then if you have some chub you want to get rid of, then you run a fat loss program or a get lean program. So you get rid of the body fat, and then you build muscle on the backside of that, because the body has now been depleted and is ready to rebound and regrow. So you can build some muscle on the backside of that. And you can run that a little 4-phase cycle ad infinitum, right? That's like the 4th time we've used that ad infinitum, right?
I think the next episode we do needs to be in Latin.
In Latin, that's right.
Yeah.
It'll be a short episode.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Well, likewise with me. I know very little except for the stuff that makes you sound smart in conversations.
That's
so it would
right.
be like, that persona non grata would be another good one.
Exactly.
Gratis. I use that periodically.
Yeah. So yeah, I think running one of those 2 parallel tracks works well for what do you do after the giant, or what do you do after whatever. So if I could give anybody a set of tools, those would be the 2 sets of tools to use. Pick one of those things. Don't be the guy like myself. Like I have been that guy where you just refuse to take care of business, and you're like a kid who's eating Cocoa Pops all the time instead of eating his, vegetables. Mm-hmm. And then things break. Yeah. You go, oh man, I keep hurting my shoulder. Well, maybe you should take care of that. Yeah, but I want to press heavy. I understand that, but maybe now's not the time to press heavy, right? Or you keep hurting your back. Well, I don't like doing dead bugs. They're boring. How boring is it to not be able to bend over and put your socks on? That's pretty boring, right? Because you keep hurting your back.
Yeah.
Right. So
I think that that's an excellent explanation. And, I'm sure that there are going to be certain people who hear that, particularly people who are very focused. I don't even want to call it minimalism. I want to call it reductionism.
That's probably so I think if you could sum up the topic of this conversation, it would be mistaking minimalism for reductionism.
Might even have to make that the top or the title of the podcast, because I think that that's really what it comes down to. I mean, like, there are people who, and I'm not, not talking trash. I'm just pointing out, because in many cases, these are people who don't have a lot of training under their belt. They're very enthusiastic, which is excellent. They just need to be guided slightly better. And I think that when you're talking about the cycles in particular is exactly one of the things that I would recommend to people, because, I know that, for instance, you've got a certain amount of time before the law of adaptation is going to kick in and say, okay, you're just not going to keep getting stronger just doing 3 to 5 sets of 3 to 5 reps, 3 to 5 days a week. Something is going to have to change. Either you're going to have to, increase the number of reps you do per set. You're going to have to decrease the rest time. You're going to have to increase, the total number of reps in your training. But no matter what, you can manipulate these variables for a while, but you're still going to butt up against restrictions eventually. And I think one of the biggest ones that people, or 2 of the biggest ones that people butt up into is muscle imbalances that are perfectly avoidable if you are committed to cycling through things, because you don't have to do everything all at the same time. But over the course of time, you should be working your way through not even necessarily everything, but enough of the things that are going to maintain and help you to gain all of the strength and mobility and athleticism that you want. And so this idea of reductionism is, it's like, well, I'm only going to do swings and get-ups. All right. And again, I'm not pointing fingers at Simple and Sinister, because this pairing has long preceded Simple and Sinister. Or I'm only going to do, I don't know, like powerlifting, like bench, squat, and deadlift. Mm-hmm. Like the idea that you can just do that ad infinitum, there we go again, without having a break, or without cycling in something that is going to be an assistant to that to help you get better when you cycle back to it, I think is fanciful thinking. And so that's really the issue, is that a lot of people, when they say minimalism, what they're really thinking is reductionism, because they have this this sort of like a stubborn idea that like, well, I'm not going to move on until I can do, let's say, a get up with 40 kilos. And they're
Right.
currently at like 20 kilos and they've been at it for 6-8 weeks. It's like, maybe do a few other things and then come back to it, and you'll probably find your get up is going to get stronger, or your swings will be stronger, or your squats, or whatever it may be. Now, with this in mind, you gave some good ideas of how you might cycle through these 4 different approaches.
Sure.
You talked about getting lean, talked about a hypertrophy program, things like that. What are some things that people might do? Let's say if they do want to do a very abbreviated program, like just a couple of exercises, then cycle into maybe a more hypertrophy focused program, and then maybe a more get lean program. So what considerations might they make with exercise selection, for example, that's going to help them to start to actually make the progress that they're after, so that when they do come back to, let's say, swings and get-ups or clean press and front squat or whatever it may be, they're going to really start to see some measurable progress?
Well, the very first thing is just identifying your weaknesses, right? So that's going to be different it's the same for everybody, but it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
Most people do what we're doing right now. They sit. So most people are going to have forward head carriage. Most people are going to have altered breathing mechanics, faulty respiratory mechanics. Most people are going to have poor spinal stability and pelvic stability because of those 2 things, right? So those are areas you should look at right away in fixing for yourself. Insert product plug here.
Go for it.
No, I was thinking.
Well, for me, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I could insert a product plug there, but I was, but the point is, those are things that we all have in common, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, and that gives you tight hip flexors and a weak butt and, tight calves and all that good, bad posture. So those are things that everybody needs to fix. But within that general realm, right? Like you may have, that may manifest itself for you and not being able to put your arm over your head, right? So your arm is not, what's the right word? Perpendicular to the floor, right? Having word finding problems here. Probably need some more vitamin B.
Yeah, it's all that Latin that you've been using. You're getting.
It's all the Latin. That's right. Yeah. So it just depletes your brain chemicals.
Correct.
Your neurotransmitters. I think that's why we stopped using Latin, by the way. I think that's why we just went to like common German and English and all that stuff. All the
I think also the destruction of the Roman Empire may have played a role, but
it might have something to do with it.
Small role, but otherwise it was a wise decision because Latin is needlessly complicated for those of you who know anything about it.
That's exactly right. So, you need to work on the postural issues, right? The foundational issues, and then you need to work on the issues that, are pertinent. Here's a word, or germane. I think I used that correctly.
Beautiful.
Yeah, not German.
Right. Right. Not that there's anything wrong with it.
Yeah. German descent here.
Correct.
So, if you have shoulder flexion issues, you need to work on that, right? If you have hip extension issues, you need to work on that. If you have had lower back pain for 10 years and swings and get-ups haven't fixed it, they're probably not going to fix it. You probably need to do something a little different, right? So that would be how I'd address that. How do you find your weaknesses? Well, you pretty much know what they are. They find you, right? Your weaknesses are the things that hurt when you wake up in the morning. Your weaknesses are the things you can't do that you want to do. And those are the things you address and attack. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's good that you pointed this out too, because I read an interesting article recently that made a very good point that, if just good technique alone were all that it took to be able to train safely, then we wouldn't see people who have issues with their low back or their knees from doing otherwise excellent exercises. And a lot of times, again, it's just you're doing the same thing over and over again. So right now, like you pointed out, we're both sitting. The more you do that, the more your hip flexor, the tighter your hip flexors are going to be, the weaker your glutes are going to be, more likely that your respiratory mechanics are going to get messed up. But doing it a little bit is not the problem. Doing it to the exclusion of all these other things is really the problem. And so that goes back into this idea of reductionism. And if you're reducing your allowable movement down into, I wouldn't even say a minimum, I would say less than minimum, then what you can expect over the short term, it's not a problem at all. But over the long term, let's say past 6 weeks, maybe, is somewhat of an arbitrary number because it could be anything. You're just going to have a hard time enjoying your training and not running into more frustrations than where you started.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, to summarize then what we've been talking about, this idea of minimalism that Geoff has is one that I think I can agree with wholeheartedly. And not because I've been convinced, but because that was kind of my position the whole time. But because what most people call minimalism is better termed reductionism, in my opinion. Um, it's easier to take aim at the phrase that most people are going to be using. But the reality is that Geoff and I are on the same page, because Geoff is very principles oriented and understands that whatever tactics you select have to be oriented around those principles. And one of those principles, as you brought up several times, is what are your weaknesses? You have to address them. They're going to be different for everybody, but probably not that different, because we all live pretty similar lifestyles. We all have
Right.
similar interests when it comes to our training. So it's somewhat predictable what training issues people are going to come across. The individualization comes down to more the details, I think, in most cases, than just the tactics. And the details might be, minute stuff like particular things you might focus on in your restoration work, or in a warm up or things of that nature. But the reality is that once you get these things out of the way, you can more easily follow a program such as the Giant, or any of the programs or courses or challenges that either Geoff or I have put out. And you can do it without all the frustrating fits and starts that people so often encounter. But
Right.
that does require that at some point you got to make the grown-up decision to decide, like what you talked about, what people want to do. Like I'm 50-50 on that, because people may want to do a certain thing, but like you pointed out, like, oh, if your shoulder, you can't even put it over your head. You want to do a lot of military presses, it would be very not advisable. So it might be a good idea to learn how to want to do something that is going to keep you active while you get that fixed. And
Yeah.
that's part of the training process.
I think it gets into something a little deeper, which is this is philosophical, is that you have to have a strong reason why you're doing something.
Mhm.
One of the most profound periods of my training in my life, believe it or not, I've been training over 30 years, came in September of 2010, when I went to 2 RKC events back to back in Philadelphia. I was living in North Carolina. And the second one, I was driving up to see my weightlifting coach, and I reached over to grab the map in the car, and I felt a little pop in my lower back. And I thought, that's kind of weird. Probably just from 2 weeks sitting in the car. Well, by the time I got up there, I had this radiating pain across my lower back and down my leg. And we had been becoming bulletproof for about 6 months at that point, which is now original strength.
Mm-hmm.
But I just saw it as a means to an end, which was, hey, let me get back into Olympic lifting. So by the end of it wasn't even by the end of the weekend. The first day I could barely move. So that was a Thursday. I got up there Thursday night after seeing my coach, and Friday we had the course, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I could barely move. And I remember lying on the floor in the gymnasium going, dude, this is absolutely stupid. Nobody in the world cares how much your clean and jerk is, how much you can squat, how much you can snatch. The only person who cares about that is you. And the reason that's relevant to this conversation is because my wife was 3 months pregnant with our first child. And in that moment, I said, I'm going to quit this nonsense, because I had a vision of myself of being a bent over, gray-haired old guy who looked like he was 60 or 70, but was in his 40s or early 50s, and having my son, talking to one of his friends and saying, all this happened in a flash, but like, hey, where's your dad? And my son would go, he's that guy over there. He goes, oh, that looks like your grandpa. And my son goes, yeah, I know this. He's really beat up. He can't do anything, and blah, blah, blah. Right. I did not want to miss my son's childhood.
Yeah.
So as a result, as I ditched kettlebells, I ditched barbells, and all I did was becoming bulletproof, which is now original strength. I did nothing but that for probably 18 months until about April of 2012. And then I test drove Kettlebell Burn Extreme for myself, which was important because when I launched Kettlebell Burn, I couldn't do it because I was so broken and beaten up. So I had to use other guinea pigs other than myself. I couldn't survive the program. So it was a double win. But what that taught me is your why has to be significant enough to get you to do the things that you know you should do that are good for you, but you don't want to do, right? It's Cocoa Puffs or vegetables. You can't live off Cocoa Puffs. You can argue you can't live off vegetables either, but you get the point.
Right.
Vegetables are certainly better for you than Cocoa Puffs.
Certainly. Yeah. And at least they keep your steak hungry, or they keep your steak fed after you've eaten that, which is
fed. That's right.
Correct.
So,
yeah, I think that your experience is probably one that echoes with a lot of people, because I'm sure that there are tons of people out there who have had very similar revelations where it's like, is this really going to be my life? Is this really what it's going to be like as I get older? I think there are some people who are so set in their ways and afraid of stepping away from the thing that they have done for so long that they do keep doing it. And then, they end up with more problems than when they started. And then they can't do the things that they love because they couldn't put aside the stuff that they just cared so much about for 12, 18, 24 months.
I remember when I started my business, my personal training business, there was a guy. How old was I? 26 when we moved to North Carolina, 28, somewhere around there. I remember there was a guy who's about 20 years older, nice guy, but all he couldn't squat. He used the leg press. He used a belt. He had the polyethylene or whatever they are, elbow wraps, right? And he used knee wraps, and he could leg press, but he used a belt in the knee wraps on the leg press. And I was like, hey, what's going on with that? He goes, my back's so busted up, I can't squat anymore, and I have to use this. So, he literally painted himself in the corner. And I remember thinking, that's never going to be me, right? And then shortly thereafter, I hurt my back really good because I fell into the trap of reductionism, right, versus minimalism. Oh, you know what? You don't need to do any direct ab work.
Right.
That just comes from doing heavy snatches and squats and cleans. Right? There's your ab work. No. Right. So,
what I think, by the way, as a slight side note to that, I love it when people say stuff like that, because they don't apply that line of thinking to literally any other exercise. They'll be like, oh, I don't do direct ab work because your abs are going to contract hard enough when you bench and or when you squat and deadlift and stuff like that. It's like, okay, well then your lats are going to contract when you do hanging leg raises. So why don't you just not do any back work and you just do a lot of hanging leg raises? Like, no one would accept that line of thinking because it's like an absurdity. It's a perfect example of like a very common thing that people will say to avoid doing direct ab work. And incidentally, not everybody necessarily needs to do it around the clock. But to say that you don't need it because you get an isometric contraction somewhere else is like, you wouldn't apply that to your legs and say, oh, all you need to do is heavy walkouts and not actually squat, because your quads will contract plenty if you do a walkout.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting to me is the same. There's a person in a school of thought, in a school that I am thinking of directly, that says you don't need to do that. However, when you squat, you should wear a belt and you should wear knee sleeves. And by the way, it's a good idea, even though you are using a low bar, to get a pair of Olympic lifting shoes.
And you should also dial 9 and then 1 so that when you need to press that second 1, when the inevitable happens, you won't be confused. No, I think that even if there is a place for that and a time for that, the place is not everywhere and the time is not always. And the ability to think more flexibly about your training and being willing to put aside the things that you love doing in order to do the things that are going to be good for you and that you can learn to love doing, so that you can keep doing all these other things, like you said earlier, like cycling through stuff, I think is really the hallmark of somebody who's actually a real professional in their training, even if that's not their profession. And, we like to talk about being, for instance, in Strong First, being a quiet professional or just being a professional in general. And I think that having a professional approach that allows you to have fun, make progress, and then live your life and actually give your strength a greater purpose is really what it's all about. And I think you and I will both agree that you can't do that with reductionism, but maybe you can do it with minimalism, provided you defined it properly.
Correct. Yeah.
Excellent.
I agree. Yeah.
Very good. Well, Geoff, this has been a great conversation. Where can people find you online so that they can follow you and do all of your great programs and things like that?
You can just find me at my website, which is chasingstrength.com.
I'm going to buy geoffneupert.com and then redirect it to my site just so that.
Yeah, I think I've already got it, and I think it redirects to chasingstrength.com. I think I bought it on one of like those 10-year plans. So
yeah, actually, it's funny because people misspell my name so often. I actually have bought like misspellings of my name to redirect them to my website.
Nice.
Precisely, for that exact reason. But I never really, up until just like 10 seconds ago, I hadn't considered buying geoffneupert.com just as like a troll, sort of move. But you beat me to it.
What's funny is I've gone back and looked at some of the old websites I've had, and you can buy those still, but they'll cost you a couple grand. So apparently somebody thinks they can make some money.
I'll have to look at a couple of the old ones that I've had. I think a few of them have lapsed just because I was like, I'm not going to keep paying for this. I'm not developing it or whatever. And you'll be amazed at how much more you'll have to spend just to get something that might have otherwise only cost you like $30.
Hold on one second.
Sure thing.
I'm glad my family remembered that I'm on a call until 2:00 and not to disturb me.
Hi,
Oh, good.
Dad.
Yeah. See.
Hi, kiddo.
Bye, Dad.
Bye, Abby.
All right. Well, folks, chasingstrength.com. I've been there many a time. There's some really excellent information on there. You have a free ebook, right? It was Strength Secrets 2.0.
Strength Shortcuts 2.0. I'm not sure where you can find that. I probably need to put that right there on the main site. But you can poke around and find it, or you can just email me support@chasingstrength.com with the subject line Strength Shortcuts 2.0, and I'll send you a link for it.
It's definitely good stuff, folks. I have gone through it. I remember going through the 1.0 version and really, really loved that. This was many, many moons ago. But once again, chasingstrength.com. I know that Geoff is also on the the social media platforms that all of you fine folks are on, but like me, probably doesn't use them nearly as much as he once did.
Correct. Not nearly as much as is recommended that a professional should use them in order to pimp their stuff.
Correct. Well, any final words as we finish this delightful podcast?
Not that I can think of. I think we made the very important point not to mistake minimalism for reductionism, right? So
excellent.
Yeah.
I feel a meme coming on. Maybe that one you could share with people, and you could be like, all right, we finally agree on something, and then we'll get the rapprochement completely finalized. So folks, once again, chasingstrength.com. Be sure to check out Geoff's excellent information. And Geoff, thank you again for coming on the show.
And thanks for having me, Hammer. I appreciate it.
Been a pleasure. And as always, have fun. Happy training.